want to talk about sufficiency as strategy and rethinking business models, but also starting with why this is important. So first of all, basically our work revolves around a big project that Laura is also part of. So it's called the Circular X program, ERC, European Research Council funded project on innovating circular service business models. So basically the idea was that if you innovate a business model, this could achieve an environmental impact reduction of up to 90%. So we're looking into how companies might experiment, developing tools, methods, and also labs to also implement circular service business models in practice with companies. So yeah, a bit of background for this. So I think in the previous session, you also talked about business models a little bit next to the tech part. So basically the idea is if in a service business model, you keep hold of the products, then you're sort of incentivized to also optimize the long use, which is of course in line with sufficiency. So this is the idea that we investigated also in a study recently. So this is basically this particular study where we looked into the climatic impacts of business models, because already 20 years ago, people said they're really good for the environment, but no one really verified this very well. So yeah, going back to this, this is the picture of 20 years ago by Arnold Tucker. So basically you could sell a product without any service, or you could sell a service like clean laundry. And there's a lot of flavors in between. So we basically investigated whether lease, rental, pay-per-use, performance, etc. So those are the more use-oriented and result-oriented product service systems are better for the environment. I don't expect you to have very good eyes, but this is our final big picture of that. So basically we saw two big things. So on the one hand, yes, this radical reduction of up to 90% is possible for all kinds of business models, from sharing to rental, lease, paying per performance. But if you design the business model wrongly, it could actually lead to a doubling of negative impact. So this is actually not good. So we need to be quite conscious. So what does conscious mean? So basically you need to think about the inherent qualities of the product. So design for longevity, upgradability, repairability, etc. So optimizing really the product and the production process. But it's also about consumer behavior, right? So I heard you speak about the US in the previous session. So it's also about changing mindsets, and that's not so easy. So if for instance, on a Vinted or other platform, you suddenly buy a lot more, then the whole environmental impact improvement is gone. And then it's also about the broader socio-technical system. So where do we live? What is the energy infrastructure, logistics, etc.? So that also matters. But sometimes there's less in the control of businesses. So yes, this intentional design matters. So in our research, we started focusing on the circular economy, but we soon realized that people associated mainly with recycling. So basically, we created this idea of this sufficiency-based circular economy, where you make do with less and consume differently. So this is also the premises of this presentation. So circular economy should be a story then of less and more. So we need to avoid consumption, because it's always better than recycling, which always costs energy. And this is needed, of course, because we live in a finite planet. And in addition, we need to regenerate the damage that has been done. That's beyond the scope of this presentation, but that's another strand of research that we're also doing, like how to do this as part of business practice. So yeah, today we focus on the sufficiency part and also sufficiency-driven business models. So what does this mean? So it's basically about meeting human needs within the planetary limits by curbing excessive consumption levels. That's a whole mouthful. Laura created this very nice diagram where you could think a bit about that. Like, what does it mean? So as a business, you need to rethink, reduce, but also think about how you refuse consumption in total. And another categorization in this matrix is less clutter, like less stuff or simplifying things, less speed, less distance, but also less markets. So peer-to-peer models are an example of that. So giving some examples in this. So refuse, we also know Patagonia's Don't Buy This Jacket, but next to Black Friday, some companies have started this Green Friday initiative. Other examples, maybe more radical in the less market space, you could actually support self-sufficiency as a company. Like, how do you do that really? In terms of reduction, people often think about product lifetime extension and warranties and premium business models. And these are some of these examples, or exchange platforms, peer-to-peer, etc. So these are some examples of what you might think about. So yeah, the why, I think we're all quite aware of that. So preventing unnecessary consumption, and it also has a preventative character. In terms of the what, there's things ranging from the product design, which is necessary, like longer lasting and durable, but also the business model, like offering quality over quantity, selling the same product multiple times. So some companies who have very good products notice that their second-hand market, if they don't capture it themselves, others will do that. So I think a good second-hand marketplace owned by the main company could be very profitable as well. I think frugal innovations are quite interesting because we do innovations more and more complex, but why does it always have to be like that? And on the right column, you can see some of those business models. Already mentioned the premium pricing model, targeting totally new customer segments each time when you resell the product, maybe multiple times, but also taking back and reselling through platforms. Full transparency models, being very open about where your product comes from, is also related to sufficiency. And then service rather than product revenue. So these are some of these examples. They're not mutually exclusive, but these are just some examples. Laura also created a database of sufficiency sectors. So some of these examples were already mentioned during the last session. But what we could see is that these sectors really dominate at the moment. Clothing, because it has been in the picture for being one of the most unsustainable sectors and stuff we buy on an everyday basis, and actually way too much. Furniture as one of the bulky waste streams also in cities, and electronics, because again, we start to use them as disposable, so rather than as a long-lasting product. And here you see some examples from the database, like Patagonia, Vitsu, which is a furniture brand with lifelong warranties, and Fairphone, a Dutch example with fair and long-lasting and upgradable phones. But all of these examples you can see in this Business for Sufficiency database. You can see all the links below as well. And that's freely accessible and with over 150 examples now. So it's quite nice and inspiring to see that as a company, you're not alone anymore. Then we often got the question, is sufficiency something new? Because it feels like something our parents used to do. So we actually checked this by looking into advertisements of 3 companies. Denby, who's in the crockery, for instance, Levi's, jeans, of course, and Miele, who makes white goods. And basically, we could see that it's not necessarily a trend or a transition. It's a tradition. It's a bit of a mix. So some companies were more consistent than others. But you can see some of these things that companies started off being very sufficiency oriented, then that being less in the end. So we see some different patterns there. So it's not really a tradition or a trend, really. Then finally, I think it's very good to teach companies, schools, universities about this idea. So basically, the Road to Flourishing was one of the tools that was developed as part of the project for this purpose. So you see the old picture of the different forms of the economy here, and Laura turned it in this much more colorful version of that, where you actually learn from each of the steps, going from efficiency to net zero, circularity, sufficiency, regeneration, and later on flourishing as a concept to maybe replace things like GDP and economic focus. So this is roughly what it looks like. So you have these cards, so you can learn at each stage. So sometimes we do it with companies and then we reflect on how they might use it within their own business, or we use it with university students, and then it's more about, more like a fun game with also some learning aspects. But of course, there's no practical application within their own jobs. So this is sort of what it could look like. So feel free to connect with us if you're also interested in such a session. And then finally, some work with team members. So here you see some recognizable pictures, but also Ankita. So next to this tool, we also have a circular rebound tool, because we noticed that when companies design circular innovations, there's often negative rebounds. Like I said, negative side effects that you suddenly start buying a lot more secondhand because it's good for the environment anyways. So with this tool, you can try and prevent some of those effects. And finally, we also have a new Dutch project with companies like iFixit and Philips, the Dutch Consumer Guide, and it's all about fixing stuff. So tackling fixophobia as a negative thing that we don't dare or do fixing anymore. So this is a nice project that just kicked off. So I want to end this presentation also with a positive note that I always like to do. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. So thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Nancy. We are about to get to the questions and answers. So if you haven't already done so, and if you have a question for Nancy, please feel free to use the Slido. So I have a question for you. Here, there were some people saying that maybe it's not about the packaging, for example, when we were looking at previous presentations, when we were talking about e-commerce, maybe it's about eliminating e-commerce altogether. So my question for you is, how can we incentivize people to, for example, buy more long-lasting clothes, fewer but long-lasting clothes, and, for example, not having to replace their phones constantly every year or every 2 years? Do you think there should be legislations to penalize companies that keep incentivizing people to buy more, or maybe incentivizing people to buy less, for example?
Yeah, I think it should come from both sides. So you need both a carrot and a stick. So partly it's about education, even knowing what happens with your product. Also, when you send it back, right? So there's more and more news that if you sort of order from certain platforms and then the product maybe gets burned or destroyed in another way. So it's first of all about creating awareness of. So that's why I mentioned this transparency business model as well. Like I think sufficiency-oriented companies can be quite transparent about their own practices while revealing maybe what some others are doing in the unsustainable way. So this is the part that is about consumer education. In our study on the sufficiency-based circular economy, we basically also talk about the idea of consumption corridors, which I really like. Then it's Alexander, I think, right? Surname, or Laura knows the name of the exact author who came up with the concept. But basically, it means there's a lower boundary and an upper boundary in consumption levels, and you could start using that for policy as well, and saying everything above one international flight, for instance, gets taxed very heavily. So this was a discussion that is already happening, like one international flight maximum, anything above that you get taxed more. And the same with all kinds of products. You could actually put like a maximum boundary on how much clothing, electronics, everything you own. You could basically say like this is what is necessary, and everything above it is not. So but of course it also has a minimum boundary, because we're quite aware that in some countries, but also areas in the countries where we live, basically don't even have that minimum level of consumption. So that's why I think that could be a very powerful concept for policy making as well.
All right. We have a couple of other questions. So, for example, how to present a degrowth business plan in a traditional profit-based model?
How does it fit? Yeah,
Or how do you go about it?
Yeah. So one of the studies that I did last year with someone who used to work with Gap, actually, so in a more high fast fashion brand, basically. So she investigated the profit contributors of slow fashion brands, but they basically could earn more money through operational efficiencies because they had a lot less stock keeping units, for instance, so they could optimize the design of the stock keeping units they had. There was more predictability as well, and and the value chain, keeping it local. So there were a lot of things that actually kept the prices or the cost relatively low, and also they might have more customers, but more customers who buy fewer things. So there are models that make it more profitable, but that's why we're diving deep into these profit contributors of slow fashion brands, because we were intrigued by that, and they were still making money and good money as well. So. But I think for each sector, you would need to sort of dive deep into it. But I think there are operational efficiencies, predictability of stock, and that sort of stuff. So yeah.
Yes. And what other innovative approaches are you seeing? And this would be my last question. And this could be something very simple, like for furniture, for example. Do you think now, to become more sustainable, we should be building furniture that meets multiple purposes? For example, those constructive or transformative furniture that it's a sofa and then it's a bed, but then you can store things in there so that you don't have to buy an extra cabinet to store all those things.
There was something with sound. I think that multifunctionality is one of the things, and upgradability over time. I don't necessarily think it has to be with the same consumer. So sometimes it could also be less complex if the product just stays the same product, but just transfers ownership perhaps, but preferably locally as well. I think IKEA is trying to do that with its circular corner, for instance, and other brands are trying to do that as well. So I'm a huge fan of circular innovations in the sense of multifunctional product design, but I don't think it's the only solution. The other solution could also be a highly upgradable product over time. So it can also still remain a simplistic design. But for instance, the trip-trap chair for children is upgradable until, I don't know, grown up, I think. So there are brands that try to do that, but I don't think it's necessary for every product. So there are multiple coexisting strategies, I think.